If you want to learn what the best decks are for the September 2023 format, how I think they rank against each other in terms of which are best to use based off the type of tournament you're going into, and if you want to learn how to be able to download the different decks based off topping results that are all in this tier list, then check out this video.
It's time to do.
Hey everyone, this is Max and Maxi TCG. Thank you for joining me in another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a tier list for the September 2023 format. YCS Dortmund just ended, so we're going to kind of looking at how these decks kind of did and where we think they might rank based off how things are looking based off the format. So one thing I want to point out is that I did make the tier list, so if anyone wants to use it, I'm more than welcome to on Tier Maker. One of the things I wanted to add, because I think it would help new players, it's what my channel is focused around, is I did label all the decks, for competitive players looking at the images of the different cards that are mainstays in the deck. Pretty easy to tell which deck is which, but for this one I wanted to add a little bit of text to kind of help newer players so they know which the decks are. If you also want to be able to use or test out any of the decks that we're talking about, I compiled in a database you can find on my website. You can download a YDK file for every single deck that's in this tier list to be able to test out, practice against, and it's free. You just have to go to the link in the description or on my link tree, depending on where you are looking at this video. So what I want to do first is just kind of go ahead and rank everything, and then what we'll do is kind of discuss through each section, and each section will have timestamps. Okay, so now that we're done ranking all the videos, I'm going to go through the tiers so people understand how we're ranking everything. So it's probably really important for newer players that might not really understand how these work. And then we'll jump into discussing each of the decks. If you want to just jump to this because you kind of understand how the tier system works, then go ahead and jump to the timestamp where we start discussing through the different decks. If you're new to the game, you could be ranking different decks based off tiers. So we have tier 0. Generally, a tier 0 deck is the best deck in the format, and outside of maybe some very fringe like hyper counter decks that are meant to pretty much specifically beat that deck and probably nothing else for the most part, this is the deck you have to play if you want a realistic chance of winning a tournament. Right now we don't really have any decks that fall into that category. Usually you'll see about 65-70% representation when you do top cuts to see how good a deck is and figure out which deck you want to play, but generally it'll also depend on how easy it is to counter that deck. Sometimes the deck might be highly represented like Kashtira, but has a good amount of ounce to be able to play it when it was at the top of its list. Next we have tier 1. These are the best decks generally of the format. Their engines are usually stronger than the other decks in the game. They either can play around or play through very common cards that people are playing, and they generally just are the strongest deck to choose. But a lot of times choosing a deck just because the best deck of the format is not always the right choice. Sometimes you have to choose what's the best deck for a tournament. And sometimes these very high level decks, tier 1, tier 1.5, they tend to be decks that people prepare for more. So sometimes it puts more of a target on your back. So sometimes not playing these decks and going for a tier 2 or rogue deck option would be the way to go. Right, next we have tier 1.5. These are decks that are still really good. You could see them at the highest levels of competition, but generally speaking, they're just going to be a little weaker than the tier 1 strategies. Usually their engines aren't as strong, maybe they don't have as many room for attack cards to be able to help, playing against opponents' decks, or maybe they have bad matchups against the best decks, which are very highly represented. But these are still really great choices for high-level tournaments. Next we get tier 2. This is probably where you get more into like better regional level decks. They can still do well at a YCS. Maybe like a couple get in there at 1 to 3 at the most. But generally speaking, you're probably better off choosing tier 1 to 1.5 for the very high level like YCS or national events. But tier 2 are really good at locals, regionals, can do well, more mid-tier to low-tier events. Then you have tier 3, generally better for local events, can do decent, I think, at a regional event. You can do well with it at a high-level event, but generally you want to be thinking, what does my deck do that really hurts the top decks? Does it have something that's very unfair this format? You generally want to be very comfortable with the deck because your deck is generally weaker overall. You need to be playing very well throughout the event, know your deck really well, know all the other decks really well, so it is possible to take a tier 3 deck and do well with that at a tournament, but there's a lot of things that really got to be working in your favor to kind of pull that off generally. And then we have tier 4 decks. These are decks that are probably going to be better just to stick at a local level. and they either don't have the consistency or the power to kind of make it towards higher level events. You might be able to take tier 4 to a regional event and top or potentially make top cut. But generally you're going to want to have something where your deck very heavily counters some of the best decks to be able to choose a tier 4 deck. Okay, so now we went through breaking down the tiers. We're going to jump into the different decks. So we have tier 1, which is Unchained. Probably just undisputed best deck of the format right now. Throughout the first couple weeks of the format, I don't think was as understood how to play against it. Didn't have as much of a target, but especially now, I think it's the most targeted, most represented deck. It's very good at playing through different, tech cards like hand traps or even board breakers your opponent plays, so it's very resilient. It does have some consistency issues. It's more of a 2-card combo deck than a 1-card combo deck. It's done really well at top events with pro players, and has really interesting interactions, and a very fun deck to play. Next we have Purrely, or Purrely, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So Purrely is a really cool deck, have a lot of consistency, a lot of room for tech cards. One of the issues though, it is pretty easily countered. People can play Dimensional Barrier, they can play XYZ Encore, cards that get rid of non-targeting monsters like Herald of the Abyss, Rust that can get a lot of these cards. So there are some pretty heavy ways to target this deck, but it's very consistent. Can run a lot of non-engine to be able to counter your opponent, like hand traps or board breakers. Very solid deck, but can be countered. And that is what happened at YCS Dortmund. I think a lot of people were preparing for this deck, thinking it was going to be very represented. And it did hurt, I think, the deck's ability to win at that tournament. Next we have Rescue Ace. So Rescue Ace, I almost consider it a tier 1 deck. I think it's like the fringe here, but I think it's just a little too weak. I think once Age of Overlord comes out and we get to be able to better search Hydrant, I think it's the Despoils archetype. I think that will push this deck to tier 1 then. For now, I think it's one of the best decks to be able to play in the current format. It doesn't care about a lot of the cards that hurt Purrely. It has some really good boards that it can do. Very strong kind of simple monster beatdown strategy. You can search 4 of its cards with its main combo. I think one of the things is that at YCS Cancun, it was ran with Ibly, which could lock your opponent out. And I think that's a good card when not expected. But depending on how it goes, you might have to adjust what your board is and what you're trying to make based off the events. When everyone's expecting Ibly and playing Lingaribo in their deck, you're not going to do as well playing Rescue Ace in that combo line. Next we have Branded Chimera. So Branded Chimera is a really cool deck. I think it does something that the standard Branded Despia deck is not able to do. I actually have to move that to tier 2. Branded Chimera is a solid deck because it has Chimera Fusion and Branded Fusion, where the regular Branded deck really gets hurt by Branded Fusion getting ashed. It can still play through it and has ways to try to counter it, but overall I think the Branded Chimera version is really interesting because there's the room for a lot of tech cards, and you have 2 major cards that you want to hit with Ash Blossom. And if they start with Branded Fusion, you're not going to know is this Branded Despia or Branded Chimera. If you don't ash it and it's Branded Despia, that's, you might just lose. But if you ash it here, the Chimera Fusion is really the card you want to wait for. So it's kind of a guessing game, and I think that gives this deck a really good edge. Next we have for hire Runick Spright. So all the Runick decks really didn't get hit outside of Fountain being at 2, and they pretty much went untouched in the last ban list. I do think that the deck can struggle because when these very high combo decks like Mannadium, Rikka, Drytron, Infernoble are in the format, they don't do well against a lot of like heavy negate boards because they don't have a lot of room for non-engine to be able to stop those decks. They more want to kind of break boards with board breakers or higher impact cards. But with kind of the fact that these are more sitting towards the tier 2 and not as highly represented, I think it's okay to still play these decks and they could do okay. I don't know if they're going to be the greatest because I don't think they did super well at YCS Dortmund, so they might be moving lower down the tier list. But overall, I think they're solid decks to choose. I think the for hire Runick Spright doesn't lose to Bestials like the Live Twin Spright does, so that's one thing to consider with choosing this version. Next we have Flu. So Flu is a really great deck in terms of countering Unchained, but it does have consistency issues. It's a cheap deck now due to all the reprints, and people that played Kashtira as like the dominant shifter deck, now that this deck has been hit and probably not going to see as much representation, players that might go back to playing Flu, so we might see it, and it's done well in some tournaments. So overall, a solid deck, easy to get into but hard to kind of master. It could be great for getting newer players into the game since it's more of a tribute summon style deck. Right, next we have Runick Spright Live Twin. So again, very similar to the Runick for Hire. Doesn't play well into large negate boards. Does have an issue against Bystials, which are kind of common since they can counter Unchained. And we also see that with Dragon Link playing them, and a lot of decks are siding them. So I think this deck does get hurt by that a lot. Does have the ability to run droplets now that Kashtira is gone, and that's an amazing and a board-breaking card you can play for going first or second. That really functions well within the deck. It's very fluid with the way it interacts with the cards. So it can be a really big plus for playing Runick Spright Live Twin. I think you can do okay. I think it will depend on how many Bystials you run into, and you could run into some issues because of that. Alright, so next we have Dragon Link. So Dragon Link did get some pretty big hits on the ban list with Chaos Space and Magnamut going to 1. That does hurt the deck, but Dragons always have had a lot of really great options to be able to kind of change those cards out with other cards. They won't be as powerful, but they still will make the deck consistent and very good, and with Bystials being even better into the format than I think they've seen before Dortmund, I think that gives this deck a really good edge. Next we have Labrynth. So Labrynth's an interesting one because I think we always think it's going to do well. Sometimes it kind of feels like it hovers more towards tier 2, sometimes it feels like it's tier 1. It kind of just depends on the format. I think the issue with Labrynth is when it's really prepared for, it doesn't do as well. I think now people aren't playing Bell as much and more going towards Crow, which helps Labrynth, since you can't Bell the big welcome anymore. But I think overall, Labrynth is a really solid deck, and you can do well with it. I think we've seen some pretty interesting lists with, I think, Tom Klein, who is the German national runner-up, playing it with some Runick cards to kind of protect against blowout cards. So I think some pretty interesting developments might have been made with Labrynth. It'll be fun to look into. Next we have Tearlament. So personally, I don't really think this deck is that great. I think it's okay. I think it is good amount of gambling when it comes to the RNG of this deck, and you could definitely build it to make it as good as possible. It did make top 8 at the tournament, so it did do well, piloted by really good players. But I think those players could have done well with almost any deck they chose that was a solid pick in their mind. So I think Tearlament was partly played due to the nostalgic of people really loving the deck, being a tier 0 format. A lot of pro players loved it because it's a skill expression of playing in the mirrors. It's the first time you could really play it well since Kashtira was hit, even though it still did top some events here and there when Kashtira was at its rise. But a solid deck, but I think it just runs into the consistency, and I don't know over a long 12-round tournament if this really is the pick to go for. I think due to the representation, it did do well this weekend, and that could definitely give more of a rise to Bystials in the side deck, and decks that are using like Dragon Link and Despia doing well because of that. Next we have Branded Despia. I think it's a solid deck, potentially tier 1.5 at the back end. I think Chimera Branded is better right now, but this deck is still very solid. It can definitely pull up some really great locks that prevent your opponent from playing with the Gimmick Puppet. I don't like the lock, but it is a good one that you can utilize and stop a lot of decks from being able to play. So I think choosing still the more standard Branded Despia deck is still a very solid option. You don't have as many room for tech cards like in the Chimera version, but you are going to be running a good amount of extenders and ability to potentially play through more cards. But still a very solid deck, and did top the YCS Dortmund. So next we have Plunder Patrol Runick. So I think this is probably the weakest of the Runick decks, but probably my favorite. I always love Plunder Patrol and how they play. I think you do some really interesting things. It was really great during Kashtira format since you give your opponent a token that would ruin their strategies. We could potentially see them still doing this strategy with a Floodgate, like goes in, locking into an attribute. So I think we could still see this deck doing quite well. Then we have Dark World. Again, now that Kashtira is gone, kind of the solitaire deck that just can combo off, push through boards going second, be really scary going first, just out advantage your opponent. But it does run into bricking at times. If you build the deck well, that definitely helps. But I do think it's still a very scary deck to look out for. But I think due to the difficulty of the deck and the issue of bricking, it does run into some issues. But it's also a structured deck, so we might see more of this around the local level than maybe at higher tier events. So next we have Infernoble, a really solid and a combo, just go off type of deck. I think part of it with these combo decks, it's not necessarily that one of these is better than the other. I do think Infernoble, Mannadium, and Rikka Sunavalon are better than Drytron. but all of these decks are scary when they go unerupted. And when people go towards more of a board breaker format, I think these decks are always scary because they kind of do what they want. And that could be an auto lose. But if you are playing more hand traps, I think you can generally cut these decks off if you have 2 hand traps. So it kind of depends on where the format is. We're in a weird spot because of triple tactics thrust, being able to search cards like tactics if they have a monster on the field when they activate the effect, or other cards to be able to play through boards. So hand traps are kind of in a weird spot between board breakers and hand traps, which makes these decks kind of a weird spot to pick. The way I think about these for the most part is I think Infernoble is better at playing through hand traps due to being able to do the connector pack, just start Dolphin and see your opponent's hand, rip out a hand trap generally, and then be able to kind of see what the rest of their hand is to play around it. I think Mannadium has the strength of being able to run more tech cards, so that maybe can help more going second, but I still think the deck struggles going second overall. Rikka Sunavalon, a really good 1-card combo deck that can really go off. Play some tech cards. It won the YCS Dortmund in Germany. Still a very solid deck if you're really good at it, but it's very complex and hard to play, and you have to know a lot of combo lines and how to navigate the deck. So again, a really good deck, but very difficult. And then Drytron. Drytron, very similar type of kind of lock your opponent out of playing type of strategy. I think it does lose to Bestials, can be really hurtful to the deck overall. I think Mannadium, you could argue, maybe loses to it somewhat too, but I think Drytron especially, so that might be an issue for Drytron if Tearlament becomes popular like it's showing, and people play more Bestials, that might hurt Drytron in the crossfire. All right, next we have Melffy Spright, solid Spright variant. I don't think Spright overall is as good as it used to be, and it's kind of all variants are stuck in the tier 2 pile. One thing with this Melffy Spright deck is that you do have a lot of tech cards, so that's good. But I think overall, okay deck to play, solid at tier 2 regional events. Maybe you can do okay at a higher level event, but definitely good for regional locals. Tri-Brigade Spright, I think this would be the variant I would choose. I think it's a strong deck overall, can play a good amount of hand traps, has access to be able to search Crow when the board's broken, and non-target banish with Revolt. Overall, I think a very solid deck. Go first and second, which is one thing I really like about this variant, and has a more like split interaction with back row, hand traps, field, I think maybe than Melffy Spright does. So very solid deck. I think it would be personally my choice, but I think representation wise we'd definitely see more Melffy Spright and maybe even more going second Spright at the moment. So going second Spright is an option people are choosing for, just kind of breaking boards. I think part of the issue with Spright right now is with Thrust, you're able to get to a lot of cards that break the Spright board, so it does make the deck a lot weaker going first than it used to be, which is why I think a lot of people are deciding to go second with the deck. You can run a lot of board breakers to hurt your opponent and just kind of OTK them with Gamma Burst. People are running cards to go first like Ibli, but again, if people are running Linkaribo because of Rescue Ace, that type of lock isn't as good going first. And I think if people know you're going first when you're getting to the higher kind of like top cut areas of the tournament and you get later stages, people choose to make you go first, that could really hurt since you're running a lot of board breakers. And generally these board breakers aren't going to be as good going second. And then we have Plunder Patrol Adventure. Solid deck with the way Adventure works with the Plunder Patrol engine. Definitely I think good at a regional and local level. I think can do okay at a YCS level if you're very confident with it. But I do think it's going to run into some issues overall, and I don't think it's necessarily the best pick in comparison to some other decks you might be able to choose. But if you like the deck, I think it can do well. And with the Adventure core being reprinted and the Plunder Patrol stuff being reprinted, the deck is quite cheap, and it could be a fun pickup for anyone to play. But I personally think I prefer the Plunder Patrol Runick variant over the Adventure variant, just due to the versatility of the Runick cards. Alright, so next we have Tier 3, which is Exosister. So Exosister is a solid deck, did well last format, a good way of countering graveyard decks, really strong banishing removal. But I do think one of the things Exosister runs into is it really wants to sit on Magnifica, and any deck that sits on one main monster I think can really get punished, since Purrely is kind of the best deck at doing that. So any deck similar to Purrely in terms of sitting on a boss monster or one card, if that card gets outed, I think the strategy falls apart. so I think that can be an issue with the deck. So I think that's one thing that kind of lowers its presence, is the fact that it can be countered by similar cards to the Purrely strategy. Finally, Swordsoul, a deck that I think overall is just a little too fair, but still a very solid deck and can do well at locals and regional events. Maybe scrape into the top cut of a high event, but I think it would be hard. I don't think the deck does enough that's unfair, but can run an okay amount of hand traps and play a pretty diverse game in terms of preparing for what your opponent does. So the next we have Salamangreat. It's got new support, new cards came off the ban list. I think we could see this doing well. I kind of want to put it towards the bottom of tier 2, but I think right now I'm going to see it be kind of tier 3 right now, just due to the fact that I don't think the ceiling for what the deck does going first is enough. I think if we can mitigate that and make the board going first stronger somehow, I think the deck would do better. Which right now it really just still depends on having the trap cards to really be able to beat your opponent. And I think relying on that isn't enough, unfortunately. Going first anymore, you can have 1 negate or like to 4 pops, which is still pretty strong. But I don't think it just is enough. Going second, you have access line OTKs. You have a way to OTK within the Firelock, which is really nice, using Chimera, Salamangreat, Violet Chimera, which is really cool. And in my website where the deck is for the download, there is a combo line that Joshua Schmidt shows about how to do the OTK with Salamangreat through the Firelock lines. If you want to check that out, go to the link in the description or my link tree to kind of find out that information and to see how the deck plays. So Vanquish Soul, again, got second place at YCS Dortmund. I think it's a solid deck, but I don't know if it's good enough. It really relies on Ryzen. When it gets the new support in Age of Overlord, it'll help it some, but I think the problem is unless you can consistently get to Ryzen all the time, I think the deck is going to struggle and play a good amount of hand traps and benefit based off the attribute choices you're using, but I think overall it just isn't strong enough yet. I think a better mid-range deck in the OCG because of how it plays with Maxi, but I think in our format, a little lackluster, but still a solid deck. And again, someone choosing this deck, making really good meta calls on how their deck build, what they're going to play against, how well they played, so you can still do well at a high level event even within this category, if you're making those right decisions based off what you think is going to happen and you happen to call it right. Sometimes the decisions you make sound like they're going to make sense, but sometimes you overcorrect or overtune for what's going to happen, and the format hasn't caught up yet. Next we have Kashtira. So personally, I think power level, even with the Rise Heart gone, the Kashtira main deck monsters are still very strong, and it might be more like bottom tier 2, but I think in terms of representation, we're really going to see it more towards tier 3. I think we might see more people play Flu. We might see some different variants that I also have on my website where you can download the deck profiles. There's Punk Kashtira, Pure Kashtira, Raid Raptor Kashtira, all decks shown by Squiddy, and I have a link to his video in the description. On the website, you can go through and find the deck and find that video to see where he's talking about it. I think the deck's okay. Strong main deck monsters, but I think just due to the hits, we're going to see less people run it. Next we have Dinosaur. Personally, I don't like this deck. I also want to put it in tier 4. I don't think it's very good. I think it's bricky. When it goes off, it can be very scary, but a lot of times when it doesn't, the board's completely mediocre. I've never really been a fan of dinosaurs, but I do think it can be scary enough where you should still maybe expect it more at a local to maybe regional level at times, and can top events still. But I really don't plan to see this at a YCS level event. Next we have Scareclaw. Again, reprinted cards can be played with the adventure engine if you want, which is solid so they don't rely on their normal summon. Overall, a decent deck, kind of aggro control style, kind of beatdown deck that has a boss monster that can be hard to out for certain decks, so that can be an advantage. But I just don't know if the deck does enough. I think can play into Nib pretty hard if you don't have the adventure engine, and Nib is kind of popular because of Unchained at the moment, so people are at least generally citing it, so it runs into the crossfire of that. But decent deck overall, pretty cheap, so definitely expect to see it at local and maybe regional level events. Traptrix, another structure deck that you can get for pretty cheap and build for the most part playable with just 3 structure decks. Did really well when Kashtira was a top deck due to the fact that the trap cards could set the monsters and they could easily search that. So a very good Kashtira matchup. The deck's okay. I think it's just a little bit average and not as great now. I wouldn't really expect to see this above a local event, maybe regional event here and there. but still a decent deck that you can do pretty well with for the cost that it takes to build. Next we have Marincess. So again, gonna kind of fall into the same issue with Purrely. Generally relies on one boss monster, but does get to play a lot of hand traps. I think the board can be pretty prone to like removal interruption that could really hurt the deck. That we could see with Unchained, we're having their trap card that can pop, and other decks being able to remove monsters. So I think Marincess kind of falls into getting hurt by the cards that like Unchained's playing. Also gets hurt by people countering, Purrely. So I think we're going to be running into issues with that just not being good enough at the moment. But it can definitely be an okay event, a deck for like regional to local levels for sure. And we have Hero, pretty strong OTK deck that can, combo off pretty well, but is doing better I think towards the end of the Kashtira format. And I don't know we've really seen much of it now. I think it's an okay deck that you'll see it like regional to local, but really haven't seen anything at the YCS level yet. Then we have Altergeist, got support. I think it kind of runs into a weird issue with the fact that it's a control deck that plays trap cards, so it's not as good going second. But now they're kind of like a hybrid combo deck, but not all the cards combo together. You need certain interaction between two card combos. So when it goes first, it can do really well, but even when it went first before, it was pretty good. So I think it's just kind of an average deck right now. It doesn't have as much of an identity as it had before, and does have some issues with, again, playing trap cards. And any type of trap deck on the list is going to suffer with it not being Labrynth, which is probably the best trap deck to choose, which is going to make these decks lower on the list generally. Next we have Mikanko, actually topped I think 32, the YCS Dortmund. I'll have the updated deck for that in my website. We can download everything and see the profile. I think it's a decent deck, can really catch people off guard if you don't know how to play against it, and pull off some really cheesy OTK lines. We can do some interesting stuff with being an engine for Tearlament, so decent deck, but I think if people are more expecting it and learning how to play against it, it'll be easier to beat. And I don't think the deck does a lot going first, which can be a big issue with kind of these going second decks. Like with going second Spright, I think can do well at a regional or local level, but I don't know if it would do really great at. Next we have Dinomorphia. Again, another trap deck. Kind of falls into getting hurt by Purrely because it wants to end on a big fusion boss monster that skill drains the field and kind of plays kind of aggro control beatdown. Again, people are going to be citing to out these big boss monsters, which is going to hurt Dinomorphia. It's a trap deck, so it's going to be slower. It pays life points, so it's not as good in time. So again, cheap deck now that you could play, I think, at a local level and do well, maybe a regional, but wouldn't probably be my first choice for a trap deck, and I'd probably choose Altergeist before I would choose that, and then choose Labrynth as the next one. Next, you have Sky Striker. An okay deck. People tend to really like it. With Thrust being popular in the format, maybe that's enough to kind of help push it ahead sometimes, to search engage and play other cards. But overall, people thought this was going to be huge when Thrust came out. It was predicted to be a tier 1.5 deck, but really just kind of fell into tier 2, tier 3-ish type deck when topping. But again, a very experienced player with good meta calls might be able to do well with the deck. I think one of the big issues is going first, kind of like Salamangreat. The boards it makes and the way it grinds just isn't good enough in today's current metagame. If they have a bunch of uninteraction cards with their grind game, then maybe that, they can play with either hand traps or, multiple Widow Anchors, something to help it. But overall, I think it's just kind of a mid-tier deck. Next, we have tier 4. So these are the decks I really won't take to anything above the locals. We have Ninjas and Eldlich. I really like Ninjas and the way they play, but they just really suffer to consistency. They only have like 4 starter cards that they could really play with 3 Hanzo and reinforcements to Surge Hanzo. The deck was pretty solid during Kashtira format since the whole deck's strategy focuses around flipping monsters face down, which is really good. When Kashtira was the best deck since it really hurt Kashtira, gave you a really good favorable matchup. That's kind of what you're looking for when choosing a lower level deck. Can it hard counter some of the best decks? Now with that not being in the format, with the consistency issues, I don't know if it's the best deck to really be playing at anything above the local tournament. Next we have Eldlich. I think again, just a worse trap deck. Can play a lot of floodgates. The deck can still top. It wouldn't be my first choice in terms of trap decks. I think Labrynth is much stronger, but Eldlich did used to be kind of the reigning trap deck for quite a long time. And maybe with some new zombie support, someone could figure something out to kind of push zombies higher back up to maybe tier 3 or tier 2 status. Alright, so that covers all of the tier list and kind of talking through it. I hope that was insightful to kind of help you on deciding what you want to pick. Again, check out the website if you want to download all the YDK files for all the decks below. Eventually going to work on even widening that out further with archetype breakdowns, combo guides, abilities to kind of direct people towards references to easily buy all the cards. I'm going to really work on pushing that out over time. But again, hope this is helpful. Hope the tier list is easy to understand and read for newer players. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.